Hello and welcome to another episode of The Wild West. Today we're looking at the gunfight at the OK Corral, and quite a few famous people come into play at the gunfight at the OK Corral. You've got Doc Holliday, the Earp brothers, and of course Johnny Ringo and the Cowboys. We'll be looking into all the exciting stuff when these titans come together in a close proximity. So join us, sit back in your favourite armchair, grab a coldie and relax, and let's look into the gunfight at the OK Corral. But before we get to all that, we're just going to have a quick talk about this man here. His name's Jacob Miller. An American Civil War veteran, Jacob Miller was photographed here in 1911. He's got a mini ball hole in the front of his head where he was actually shot in the line of duty. Jacob Miller lined up with his fellow Union soldiers in their firing lines. They aimed at the Confederates, who had also lined up opposite them, and after the volley, poor old Jacob was lying face down in the mud, unconscious. The shot would have been considered a perfect shot and should have been fatal. He was at the Battle of Chickamauga whilst fighting for the Union Army in 1863. He was left for dead. Everyone thought he was dead, but he regained consciousness, ended up living for another 54 years, and for 31 of those years he still had bullet fragments lodged in his brain. Yes, sir, Jacob Miller was a tough hombre. Now to the gunfight at the OK Corral. The gunfight at the OK Corral took place in a town called Tombstone, which is located in Arizona. It's a famous gunfight which pitted the Earp brothers, Wyatt Earp, who can be seen here, Virgil Earp, and Morgan Earp. And Doc Holliday against the now famous Cowboys. The gunfight itself took all of about 30 seconds. It was a very quick gunfight which resulted in the deaths of 3 men. Ike Clanton was considered the main troublemaker of the Cowboys. He was always going around making the bullets, and the others would fire them and stirring up trouble in town. It was once reported that he was saying he was going to kill Doc Holliday, and when Wyatt Earp heard this, he said to Ike Clanton, "You leave Doc Holliday alone. He'll end you before you start." And he wasn't wrong. Doc Holliday was considered the fastest gun in town at the time, although the leader of the Cowboys, Johnny Ringo, was a worthy adversary and probably just as quick or close to it. Both men were fast on the gun and quick with tempers. Doc Holliday, he had once been reported as playing a game of cards, as he quite often did in his later years. He was a professional gambler. And he won a hand of cards, and the man turned his cards over, which you're not supposed to do unless you call and pay for the privilege. The man didn't do this, and he turned the cards over. Doc Holliday warned him not to do that. Again, he did it a second time, and he warned him again. The third time, Doc Holliday took his Bowie knife and spilled his guts all over the cards table. Doc Holliday was known as a man you didn't mess with, and was well known for his quick temper. Probably stemming from the fact that he had tuberculosis, TB, and he knew that he only had so long to live. It was rumoured by some that he probably had a death wish and was looking for someone to help him along the way. Unfortunately, he was just too damn good and ended up dying of the disease later in life. Doc Holliday had a girl that used to hang around him called Big Nose Kate, and she was a legend in her own right. Big Nose Kate saved Doc Holliday quite often. They both had fiery tempers, and she wasn't afraid of using guns herself. On one occasion, she actually lit a fire in town after Doc Holliday had gotten himself into trouble in a saloon. They were holding him upstairs in the hotel. She lit a fire while everyone was dealing with that. She took 2 pistols and threatened his guards, and they rode away on stolen horses, all done by Big Nose Kate. He was once said to say to Wyatt Earp, "I had to quit her, Wyatt. Unfortunately, I hit her softly over the head with my gun, so I had to quit her." They often had fiery arguments where a little bit of violence was involved, and Doc Holliday and Kate, although they were together a long time, did part ways in the end. But there was rumours they were married and all sorts of things went on. But those two were two characters that really sort of suited each other. Big Nose Kate did own her own saloon at one time and did dabble in a little bit of prostitution as well. She was definitely a person you didn't mess with and was well suited to Doc Holliday's. She was yin to his yang. Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday did exchange threats and were looking to be heading for a gunfight when they were arrested by the then town sheriff, James Flynn, for carrying guns in town. They were both fined and released. The night before the gunfight, Doc Holliday saw Clanton in the saloon and confronted him, accusing him of lying about their previous conversations. They got into a heated argument and Morgan took Holliday out into the street to get him settled down and get him away from Ike, who had been drinking steadily. Both of the men were drunk, and after a few minutes, Wyatt Earp came in and told both of them to stop quarrelling or he'd arrest both of them. Ike then told Earp that the fighting talk had been going on for a long time and intended to end it in the morning. Wyatt Earp told him that at this there's no money in it and to go home. Ike just said, "Well, you can't think that I'm going to do it, but I'm going to end it in the morning." On the morning of the gunfight, Ike Clanton was walking around the streets, making threats that when Doc Holliday and the Earps showed themselves on the street, the ball would begin. He had been said to have gone down to Doc Holliday's dwelling where he was staying and bashed on the door holding a rifle. Big Nose Kate was there alone, and she reported that he was calling for Doc Holliday to come out. At about 1 p.m, Virgil and his deputy Morgan found Ike Clayton still wandering the streets carrying his firearm. So Virgil pistol whipped him from behind, disarming him. The Earps took Ike to appear before the Justice of the Peace. Wyatt waited with Clayton while Virgil went to find Justice Wallace so a court hearing could be held. While Wyatt waited for Virgil to return with Justice Wallace, witnesses overheard Wyatt tell Clayton, "You're a cattle thieving son of a bitch, and you know I know you are a cattle thieving son of a bitch. You threatened my life enough, and you've got to fight." Ike Clayton was heard to reply, "Fight is my racket, and all I want is 4 feet of ground." When the Earps returned, it was reported that they offered Ike his rifle back and said, "Why don't you fight us right here and now, right outside the courthouse?" Ike obviously declined this offer, being as too many witnesses and right outside the courthouse. While Ike was inside being fined, Wyatt Earp turned to walk away from the courthouse, almost walking into Tom McCleary. 2 men came up short, nose to nose, at which Wyatt said, "Well, are you healed or not?" Tom McCleary said that he wasn't healed, but his pistol was clearly able to be seen on his hip. Wyatt Earp pulled his pistol from his pants and pistol whipped him twice, leaving the man lying bleeding in the street. It was early afternoon before Ike and Tom were able to get their head wounds seen to by a doctor. It was pretty cold, still a bit of snow on the ground in places, but now they were outdoors and injured from their head wounds, and Ike was still very, very drunk. At around 2 p.m, after Tom had been pistol whipped by Wyatt, Ike's 19-year-old younger brother Billy Clanton and Tom's older brother Frank McClary arrived in town. They'd heard from a neighbour that Ike had been going around town stirring up trouble, so they'd come in to see what they could do to sort things out. Both Billy and Frank were armed with a revolver and a rifle. There'd been some trouble outside of town with Apache warriors earlier in the week, or about 3 weeks before the gunfight. So it was well established and accepted that outside of city limits, carrying firearms was perfectly okay. Once Billy and Frank got into town, the first stop they made was at the Grand Hotel. They were greeted immediately by Doc Holliday. They learned about their brother's beatings by the Earps within previous 2 hours. The incidents had generated a lot of talk around town, and angrily Frank said that he would not take a drink, and he and Billy left the saloon immediately. They should have left their firearms at the hotel. Instead, they remained fully armed. Wyatt said that he saw Billy Clanton and Frank McClary in Spanberg's gun and hardware store on 4th Street filling their gun belts with cartridges. Ike testified later that Tom was not there, that he tried to buy a revolver, but the owner saw that he had a bandage on his head, so he refused to sell Ike one. Ike apparently had not heard Virgil tell him that his weapons were at the Grand Hotel around the corner. When Virgil learnt that Wyatt was talking to the cowboys at Vandenberg's gun shop, he went there himself. Virgil testified later that after he thought he saw all 4 men, Ike Clayton, Billy Clayton, Frank McClary and Tom McClary, buying cartridges. Virgil went around the corner on Allen Street to the Wells Fargo office, where he picked up a 10 or 12 gauge double shotgun. And being as it was a cold day in Tombstone that day, he was wearing a long overcoat, and so to avoid alarming the public, he hid it under his overcoat and he returned to Hafford's saloon. This is a photo of Wyatt Earp dealing cards in one of the saloons with everyone gathered around. From Spanberg's, the cowboys moved to the OK Corral, where witnesses overheard them threatening to kill the Earps. Virgil initially avoided a confrontation with the newly arrived Frank McClary and Billy Clayton, who had not yet deposited their weapons at the hotel or stable as the law required. The statute was not specific about how far recent arrived visitor could go in good faith and within a reasonable time to travel in town while carrying a firearm. This permitted a traveller to keep his firearms and proceed directly to a livery, hotel or saloon. The 3 Tombstone Corrals were all west of 4th Street between Allen and Fairmont, a block or 2 from where Wyatt saw the cowboys buying cartridges. A witness stated that he was at the OK Corral around 2:30 p.m. when he saw the 2 Claytons and the 2 McClarys in an earnest conversation across the street. He went up the street and notified Sheriff Behan and told them it was his opinion that they meant trouble and it was his duty as sheriff to go and disarm them. I told him they had gone to the west end of the corral. I then went and saw Marshal Virgil Earp and notified them of the same effect. Citizens reported to Virgil that the cowboys were down at the OK Corral and making threats and saying that they were going to take care of the Earps. And so Virgil decided he was going to go down and disarm the cowboys. He had several members of the Citizens Vigilance Committee offer support to come and help him, but Virgil refused this. He preferred to take Morgan as a special policeman. He also appointed Wyatt as a special policeman and asked Doc Holliday that morning for help with disarming the Claytons and McClarys. Wyatt spoke of his brothers Virgil and Morgan as the marshals while he acted as a deputy. Virgil Earp picked up the shotgun that he'd retrieved earlier and gave it to Doc Holliday, exchanging it for Doc Holliday's walking stick. Doc Holliday hid the shotgun under his overcoat so as not to alert passerbys that he had it. As usual, the Earps carried their revolvers in their coat pockets and waistbands. Wyatt Earp was carrying a .44 caliber American Smith & Wesson revolver. Holliday was carrying a nickel-plated pistol in a holster, but this was covered by his long coat, as was the shotgun. The Earps and Holiday walked west down the south side of Fairmont Street to the OK Corral and straight into Sheriff Behan. Sheriff Behan told the Earps, "For God's sake, don't go down there or they'll murder you." Wyatt said Behan had told him and Morgan that he'd disarmed them, but obviously he hadn't. And at this, Virgil Earp told Behan, "Those men have made their threats and I will not arrest them, but I will kill them on sight." When Behan said he had disarmed them, Virgil attempted to avoid the fight. He said, "I had a walking stick in my left hand and my hand was on my 6-shooter in my waist pants. And when he said he'd disarmed them, I shoved it clean around to my left hip and changed my walking stick to my right hand." Wyatt Earp said he took his pistol, which he'd had in his hand under his coat, and put it in his overcoat pocket. The Earps walked further down Fairmont Street and came into full view of the cowboys in the lot. Wyatt said he saw Frank McClary, Tom McClary and Bill Clanton standing in a row against the east side of the building on the opposite side of the vacant space, west of Fly's photograph gallery. Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne and a man I don't know, who later they realised was Wes Fuller, were standing in a vacant space about halfway between the photograph gallery and the next building west. Martha J. King was in the butcher's shop located on Fairmont Street. She testified that when the Earp party passed her location, one of the Earps on the outside of the group looked across and said to Doc Holliday nearest to the store, "Let 'em have it," to which Holliday replied, "All right." Virgil Earp was not expecting a fight after Behan had said he'd disarmed the cowboys. Virgil and Wyatt had put their pistols they were being holding in their waistbands or overcoat pocket, and Holiday had a shotgun concealed under his long jacket. Billy Clayton and Frank McClary wore revolvers in holsters on their belts and stood alongside their saddled horses with rifles in their saddlebags, possibly in violation of city ordinance prohibiting carrying of weapons in town. When Virgil saw the cowboys, he testified he immediately commanded the cowboys to "Throw up your hands, I want your guns." Wyatt said Virgil told the cowboys, "Throw up your hands, I have come to disarm you." Virgil and Wyatt both testified they saw Frank McClary and Bill Clayton draw and cock their single-action 6-shooters. Virgil yelled, "Hold, I didn't mean that," or "Hold on, I don't want that." Witnesses later would establish that the Earps' account of what actually happened was pretty accurate. Who started firing first is not clear, but Virgil Earp reported afterward that 2 shots went off right together. Billy Clanton's was one of them. Wyatt Earp testified that Billy Clanton levelled his pistol at me, but I did not aim at him. I knew that Frank McClary had a reputation for being a good shot and a dangerous man, and I aimed at Frank McClary. He said he shot Frank McClary after both he and Billy Clayton went for their revolvers. The first 2 shots were fired by Billy Clanton and myself. He's shooting at me and I shooting at Frank McClary. Morey agreed that Billy Clanton and Wyatt Earp fired first. Clanton missed, but Earp shot Frank McClary in the stomach. All witnesses generally agree the first 2 shots were almost indistinguishable from each other. General firing immediately broke out. Virgil and Wyatt thought Tom was armed when the shooting started. The horse that Tom McClary held jumped to one side. Wyatt said he also saw Tom throw his hand to his right hip. Virgil said Tom followed the horse's movement, fighting behind it, and fired once or twice over the horse's back. According to witnesses, Holiday drew a large coach gun from under his coat, stepped around Tom McClary's horse and shot him with the double-barrel shotgun in the chest at close range. Another witness said he saw Tom stumbling or running westward on Fairmont Street towards the street away from the gunfight, while Frank and Billy were still standing and shooting. The light testified that Tom fell at the foot of a telegraph pole on the corner of Fairmont and 3rd Street and lay there without moving throughout the duration of the fight. Other witnesses saw Tom stagger across the street until he fell on his back. After shooting, Tom Holliday tossed the empty shotgun aside, pulled out a nickel-plated revolver, and continued to fire at Frank McClary and Billy Clayton. Ike Clayton, who had been the whole time saying he was going to kill the Earps and Doc Holliday, he ran forward and grabbed a hold of Wyatt Earp, and he was saying that he did not want to fight and he was unarmed. To this, Wyatt Earp said, "Go to fighting or get away." Clanton ran through a door into Fly's boarding house and escaped uninjured. Wyatt Earp stood up and fired in rapid succession as cool as a cucumber and was not hit. Morgan Earp fired almost immediately at Billy Clayton when he drew his gun right-handed. Morgan's shot hit Billy in the right wrist, disabling his hand, so Billy was forced to shift his revolver to his left hand. Clayton continued shooting until he emptied his gun. Virgil and Wyatt were now firing. Morgan Earp tripped and fell over a newly buried waterline and fired from the ground. Wyatt shot Frank McClary in the abdomen, and Frank took his horse by the reins and struggled across Fairmont Street. He tried and failed to grab his rifle from the scabbard but lost control of the horse. Frank crossed Fairmont Street firing his revolver instead. Frank and Holliday exchanged shots as Frank moved across Fairmont Street, and Frank hit Holliday in his pistol pocket, grazing him. Holliday followed him, exclaiming, "That son of a bitch has shot me, and I'm gonna kill him." Morgan Earp picked himself up and also fired at Frank. Frank fell to the sidewalk at the east end of Fairmont Street. Before Frank McClary was shot by Doc Holliday, Billy Clayton, though wounded, and Frank McClary kept shooting. One of them, perhaps Billy, shot Morgan Earp across the back in a wound that struck both shoulder blades. Morgan went down for a minute before picking himself up. Frank or Billy shot Virgil Earp in the calf. Virgil, though hit, fired his next shot at Billy Clayton. Frank now entirely crossed Fairmont Street and, still walking at a good pace, according to Claiborne's testimony, fired twice more before he was shot in the head under the right ear. Both Morgan and Holliday apparently thought they had fired the shot that killed Frank, but since neither of them testified at the hearing, this information is only from second-hand accounts. A passerby testified to have stopped and helped Frank. He saw Frank try to speak, but he died where he fell before he could move. So I've got this photo which I've inserted here now, which is the aftermath, where Tom McClary, Frank McClary and Billy Clanton are in their caskets. From left to right, you've got Tom McClary, Frank McClary, and then Billy Clanton. Billy Clayton was shot in the wrist, chest and abdomen, and after a minute or two slumped into a sitting position near the original position at the corner of the hardwood house. In the lot between the house, Claiborne said Clanton was supported by a window initially after he was shot, and fired some shots after sitting with his pistol supported on his leg. After he ran out of ammunition, he called for more cartridges, but took his pistol at about that time the general shooting ended. A few moments later, Tom McClary was carried from the corner of Fairmont to 3rd into the hardwood house on the corner, where he died without speaking. Passerby carried Billy Clayton to the hardwood house where Tom had been taken. Billy was in considerable pain and asked for a doctor and some morphine. He told those near him, "They have murdered me. I have been murdered. Chase the crowd away and from the door and give me air." Billy gasped for air, and someone else heard him say, "Go away, let me die." Ike Clanton, who had repeatedly threatened the Earps with death, was still running. Ike past one of the witnesses on the street, and Johnny Behan saw him a few minutes later on Tognut Street. As the wounded lawmen were carried to their homes, they passed the front of the office of Sheriff Beanham. Beanham told Wyatt Earp, "I will have to arrest you." Wyatt paused for 2 or 3 seconds and replied very forcibly, "I won't be arrested today. I am right here and am not going away. You have deceived me. You told me these men were disarmed. I went to disarm them." Dr. George Goodfellow treated the Earp's wounds. Dr. Henry McMatthews examined the dead cowboys late that night. He found Frank McClary had 2 wounds, a gunshot beneath the right ear that horizontally penetrated his head, and a second entering his abdomen, 1 inch to the left of his navel. Matthews stated that the wound beneath his ear was at the base of the brain and caused instant death. Sheriff Beanham testified that he had heard Morgan Earp yell, "I got him," after Frank was shot. However, during the gunfight, Frank moved across Fairmont Street, putting Holliday on Frank's right and Morgan on his left. This makes it much more likely that Holliday shot the fatal round that killed Frank. When examined by Tom McClary's body, Matthews found 12 buckshot wounds from the single shotgun blast to the right side under his arm. Wounds from a single shotgun blast on the right side under his arm between the 3rd and 5th ribs. The wound was about 10 centimetres across. The nature and location of the wound indicated that it would have not been received if Tom's hands were on his coat lapels, as the cowboys had testified. Both Virgil and Wyatt testified that Holliday had shot Tom, which the coroner's examination report supported. Dr. Goodfellow testified about Billy Clanton's wounds at the Spicer hearing. He stated that the angle of the wrist wound indicated that Billy's hand could not have been raised over his head as claimed by the cowboys. Billy's arm wound, but witnesses who examined the arm closely testified later that Clayton was shot through the right arm, close to the wrist joint. The bullet passed through the arm from the inside to the outside, entering the arm close to the base of the thumb and exiting on the back of the wrist diagonally. This indicated to the judge that Billy could not have been holding this coat open, as the cowboys testified. 2 other wounds on Billy's body. The first was 2 inches from Clayton's left nipple and penetrating his lung. The other was in the abdomen beneath the 12th rib, 6 inches to the right of the navel. Both were fired from the front. Neither passed completely through the body. The wound to Billy Clayton's right wrist may have been inflicted by Morgan Earp or Doc Holliday immediately at the outset of the gunfight, as Billy was drawing his gun. Billy Clayton was armed with a Colt Frontier 1873 revolver, 44 caliber, which were identified by the serial numbers at the Spencer hearing. CS Fly found Billy Clayton's empty revolver in his hand where he lay and took it from him. Frank McClary was also armed with a Colt Frontier 1873 revolver, 44 or 40 caliber, which was removed by laundryman Fullahay on the street about 5 feet from his body, with 2 rounds remaining in it. Fullahay placed it next to Frank's body before he moved to the hardwood house. Dr. Matthews laid Frank's revolver on the floor while he examined Billy and Tom. Cowboy witness Wes Fuller said he saw Frank in the middle of the street shooting a revolver and trying to remove a Winchester rifle from his saddlebag on his horse. The 2 Model 1873 rifles were still in their saddlebags on Frank and Tom McClary's horse when they were found after the gunfight. If, as was customary, Frank carried only 5 rounds when he had fired only 3 shots. Tom McClary witnesses differ about whether Tom McClary was carrying a weapon during the shootout or not. No revolver or rifle was found near his body, and he was not wearing a cartridge belt. White testified that he had arrested Tom earlier in the day and found him carrying a weapon in violation of the city ordinances. He pistol whipped him and took the gun from him outside the courthouse, where he eventually ended up getting a fine for carrying this revolver. Several cowboys witnessed and testified that Tom was unarmed and claimed that the Earps had murdered a defenceless man. 2 months later, on December 28th, friends of the slain outlaws retaliated against Virgil. They shot him in the back, hitting him with 3 shotgun rounds, shattering his left arm and leaving him permanently maimed. Virgil Earp died on October 19, 1905, after suffering from pneumonia for about 6 months. A bullet intended for Wyatt struck close above his head. Once again, the Earps believed they knew the men responsible, that testimony of key witnesses was inadmissible as evidence, and the cowboys were not charged. Wyatt assumed Virgil's duties as Deputy US Marshal. 2.5 months later, after ambushing Virgil, went after Morgan, shooting him at night through a window of a door while he was playing billiards, and killed him. After Morgan had been shot, his brothers tried to help him. Before he died, it was reported that he said, "Don't touch me, I can't stand it. This is the last game of pool I'll ever play." They moved him to the floor near the card room, where Dr. William Miller arrived first, followed by Doctors Matthews and George Goodfellow. They all examined Morgan. Goodfellow, who would earn recognition in the United States as a national leading expert treating abdominal gunshot wounds, concluded that Morgan's wounds were fatal. Frank Stitwell and Pete Spence were the 2 cowboys that were suspected in the murder of Morgan, and they were put on trial but were never convicted. The cowboys suspected in both shootings were let off with technicalities and lack of evidence. Wyatt Earp felt he could not rely on criminal system, so he got himself his own posse together and swore that he was going to get everybody involved and justice for the murder of his brother and maiming of his other brother. He concluded that he could not rely on the courts for justice and decided to take matters into his own hands. He believed that the only way to deal with the Earps' enemies was to kill them. He assembled a federal posse and intercepted Frank Stitwell laying in wait near the train station in Tuxton and killed him. They then scoured the countryside looking for the others they believed responsible. During the early April of 1882, Wyatt and his posse tracked down and killed Florentino, Indian Charlie Cruz, Curly Bill Broncos, and Johnny Barnes. 3 of the men they believed were responsible for their brother's ambush and murder. The ride of vengeance came to be called by Earp Vendetta, or the Earp Vendetta Ride. 5 of the Earp party were wanted on a warrant for killing Frank Stitwell, and they left Arizona Territory never to return. Wyatt Earp did eventually get justice for his brothers, and a lot of cowboys ended up dead. Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo, they were said to have had quite a few feuds and hot words. Johnny Ringo was one day found leaning against a tree with a bullet hole in his head. Some say it was self-inflicted, but there is a wide consensus where people suspected that Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo had had a private shootout, with Holliday coming out on top. This is just what's sort of rumoured and thought. No one knows for sure. No one will ever know, just except for the 2 people involved or the 1 person involved. Wyatt Earp was also friends with Bat Masterson, another famous gunslinger. Wyatt Earp actually encouraged him to become a lawman, and they were good friends. Later in life, Wyatt Earp and John Wayne would get to meet each other. Weren't real great friends, but did know each other through mutual friends. Wyatt Earp died in his home in Los Angeles at the age of 80. The cause of death is believed to be a chronic cystitis, hard word to pronounce. His longtime companion Josephine had his remains cremated, and he was cremated in Colma, California. So there you have it, a rough story of the gunfight at the OK Corral. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you again on the next one. Until then, look after each other. Bye for now.